participation webinar. This is one of the 5 dimensions proposed for the UNDP LGBTI Inclusion Index. My name is Lucas Pauli. I am a project manager at Micro Rainbow International and one of the authors of ILGA's state-sponsored homophobia report. My co-chair today is Andre Duplessis, the head of UN programs and advocacy at ILGA. Please note that the session is being simultaneously translated into French and Spanish, so please speak slower than you would normally, about 20% slower, so that the translators can keep it up. If you're receiving translation and have any technical issues, please let us know in the chat box below. As you all know, this is a civil society consultation intended to reflect and review on the list of indicators proposed for the political and civic participation dimension. We may have some participants from multilateral organizations and governments on the webinar today. You're welcome here, but we kindly ask you not to comment on the webinar, as this is the space for discussion for civil society. So far, we have a number of 14 people in the call, and we'll take people's inputs one by one. Before we start, I would like to agree with you on a couple of rules. First, if you'd like to speak, please enter your name and the word "speak" in the webinar chat box. From this, we will create a speakers list and then invite people to speak one by one. Second, I kindly ask you to mute your mics while you're not speaking. Third, please be considerate and try not to talk over other participants or the chairs. And finally, please make your intervention concise and keep your comments focused on the criteria for reviewing the indicators, rather than reflecting on your personal, local, or national context of the lack of inclusion that LGBTI people experience in relation to political and civic participation. We hope everyone understands these are the frames of our discussion. We also want to stress that we hope everyone has had a chance to listen to the recording of the introductory webinar and is clear on what the Inclusion Index is. That is the outcome of a consultative process which included civil society participation in 2015 and what this consultation process is about. If you remain unclear about this, unfortunately, we do not have enough time to go into discussion on this webinar today. If you have a very burning question about the process, please note your question in the chat box and we will address it later. As you know, this webinar is a part of a series of webinars conducted this week by the UNDP and the World Bank. We want to mention that throughout this consultation, difficult choices will be made about the number of indicators that can be operationalized for each dimension and for the index overall at this initial stage of its development. To start, let's briefly review the list of indicators which have been proposed for measuring the political and civic participation dimension. Micah, could you please bring the slides? Thank you. So, for the political and civic participation dimension, we've got the first aspect of inclusion is recognition. And the first indicator is the criminalization of same-sex conduct, which will look at consensual homosexual acts between adults if they're legal. The second aspect is the criminalization of transgender people. And it will look at the laws that criminalize transgender people on the basis of their gender expression. The third indicator is gender recognition requirements, and it will look at how states allow gender recognition without sterilization or medical interventions, divorce, or psychological diagnosis or assessment. And the fourth is the process for updating sex gender in documents, and it will look at how centralized protocols for updating sex gender in official certification is available in the countries. The other aspect of this dimension is freedom of expression and association. The first indicator here is promotion or morality laws. And the second one is LGBTI NGOs allowed. So for promotion or morality laws, this indicator will look at the existence of a law focusing on promotion or morality that targets freedom of expression related to SOGI-esque. And for the second indicator, we will look at if NGOs that promote the interests of LGBT individuals are permitted under the law. The third aspect is political participation, and there is only one indicator proposed so far, which is LGBTI people in parliament. So here, we'll be looking at the percentage of members of parliament or other national representative body who are openly gay. The fourth aspect is public opinion, and it consists of two indicators. One, if homosexuality is acceptable, and the second one, if being transgender is acceptable. So these are the list of indicators that have been proposed. And this webinar here will be able to reveal if they are feasible and if there are any other gaps in this list of indicators. I would like to begin the discussion by asking my co-chair for his initial reactions on LGBTI's people, political and civic participation. Andre, could you please share your impressions on these indicators so we can set the scene for discussion and any relevant feedback you may have?
Sure, and thank you very much, Lucas, for co-chairing this call here, and welcome everybody. Today I can see we've got about 20 people on this call, and I'm sure some people will join as we go. Thanks very much for this chance just to kind of give some initial thoughts on what we're seeing on these indicators on civil and political rights. So what I actually, when I was looking at these, and thank you for highlighting the difficult choices that are going to have to be made in somehow, how are we as LGBTI people being included in political and civic, life and rights. We're going to have to, how we actually measure that and the difficult choices that have to be made. And I know that we have a maximum number of 10 indicators and there's already 9 listed here. So immediately as I start, I'm just very, very aware of that framing that we have to speak under. What I was actually, as I was reflecting what I was going to say, I had a look back, because I'm an international lawyer. I went back to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and just reminded myself what actually kind of our civil and political rights are. And so just I'm not going to read the entire covenant for you, be glad to know, but just a reminder of the things that are in there. It's on the death penalty. It talks that death penalty should be only imposed for the most serious crimes. Article 7, no one should be subjected to torture, and that includes no one being subject to for free consent on medical or scientific experimentation. Article 9 is making sure that no one is subject to arbitrary arrest or detention. Article 10 is persons that are deprived of their liberty should be treated with humanity, so prison conditions. Article 12, we talk about the freedom of people to move within their territory, and that includes the freedom to choose a residence. Article 16, crucially, the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Article 17, that no one should be subject to arbitrary or unlawful interference with their privacy. We have the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, the right to hold opinions without interference. We've already mentioned the right of peaceful assembly and association. And we also have heard about the right and opportunity to take part in the conduct of public affairs. An interesting Article 24 is rights of children under civil and political rights, which is the right of a child to have the rights without any discrimination. And that children should be registered immediately after birth and have the right to acquire nationality. So thanks for just letting me kind of spiel quickly through some of those international civil and political rights, because for me, it became a way then to say, well, that's what we're effectively promised under international law. And in theory, each of our countries should also be providing that to us. But what I think the reality is even in places which have wonderful laws on some of these areas, actually the lived reality and experience of LGBTI people disaggregated is very different. And so I think one of the things I wanted to highlight at the beginning, as I looked at the indicators that we have, recognizing again how important the feasibility is of finding information, is do we actually have enough information on what the lived experience is of LGBTI people? One of those that struck me was arrests. Are people being arbitrarily detained, arbitrarily arrested? Maybe not necessarily under the traditional same-sex criminalization laws, but maybe under a raft of other different laws. And I think we have some of those under the first two indicators there on decriminalization of same-sex conduct and decriminalization of trans people for gender expression. But I think that it also goes a little bit more widely. I know also below we have promotional morality laws that might target some of these. But again, these are literally just the laws that are in existence. And we know that different groups around the world are often detained, arrested for public decency or other areas as well. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm interested to hear what people are going to say about that. I think also going through, I just wanted to draw the attention that I think on some of them, for example, decriminalization of same-sex conduct was listed as being potentially relevant for all 5 population groups. I think I can certainly see that for LGB, in most places for T, but I would put a question mark if that's actually relevant for I, intersex persons, and would be interested to hear from people here if they had the same thought. That said, I think also the fact that there was mention of the article in the Civil and Political Rights Convention on the rights for children and their right, again, to have a nationality, to be registered as children. And I'm interested to know if that's something which, again, might be interesting for the intersex community, and if they feel that intersex issues and civil and political rights relating to those, how those are reflected here. And I think I've spoken already for my 7 minutes. So at this point, I will hand back to you, Lucas, and I'll be able to, I'll be listening in on the call and just taking some notes and listening to the conversation as we go. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre, for your interesting views on international human rights law in relation to political and civic participation and your relevant feedback on the indicators. Micah, could you please bring the slides with the criteria to review, please? So now, I'll over to you. Having read and reviewed the indicators, we would like you to consider them by reflecting on several key questions which were shared with you already. And these are the questions on the slides. Now we have a number of 22 people in the session. Again, if you'd like to make an intervention, please write your name on the chat box, followed by the word speak. And in order to keep the discussion focused, I'll go through each question and invite those on the speak list to share their comments. Okay? So the first question here is, are the indicators being proposed going to help track and, most importantly, compare LGBTI inclusion across different countries? Yes, Justus, you may have the floor.
Hi there. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. As Andre already mentioned, I think the part about criminalization needs to be much more focused on the lived reality, because especially for trans people, particularly for trans women who are perceived to be sex workers, there's a host of laws that are being used against them that do not scream anti-trans. For example, there's a law against hitchhiking in Turkey that is being used very targeted against trans women. So I think just the existence of morality laws or gender recognition laws or criminalization of gender expression does not cover the reality at all, because there's also a lot of countries that have these laws on paper but haven't used them in decades. So that's one. Lived experience, I think, is really important there. The other thing, I think public opinion, there currently is no way of considering public opinion about intersex people. And I think that's important, because the public does have an opinion on intersex people, and especially on whether or not intersex people should be subjected to surgeries with or without their consent. And I think that's really important to have that public opinion part, to really understand the full extent to which intersex people are being ostracized. For example, in some countries, I've heard of exorcism being used on intersex people, and that's really closely linked to public opinion. So I think that's exorcism. Sorry. So I think that's an important question to be asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Justus. The Spanish interpreter is asking you to repeat the last point, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So so exorcism, meaning a religious ritual to drive out the devil in whatever form in that culture, has been used against intersex people in some countries, and I think that's very closely linked to public opinion, and that needs to be covered in the public opinion section in one way or another.
Okay, thank you, Justus. Laura, you may make an intervention, please.
Thanks, Lucas, and thanks for a great introduction and for all the work that's already gone into this. Regarding comparing inclusion across different countries, I have a comment on, I think it's the fourth indicator, the process for updating sex and gender in documents. I'm just wondering whether the way that this could be formulated could take into account countries where particularly trans and intersex people struggle to access ID documents of any kind, which is, I'm thinking particularly of Pakistan as this example at the moment, but I think there are others where people who are excluded from their families as a consequence of their gender identity struggle to access ID documents for that reason. So I'm wondering if that could be maybe broadened a little bit. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, that's a possible aspect to be included here. Thank you for your comment. Does anybody else have any other inputs on comparison? Since none, let's go through the second question. Oh, sorry, Justus?
Yes, I think when we talk about ability for political and civic participation, we also have to consider the practical aspects of political participation. So on paper, everything may be all right, but that doesn't mean that trans people, for example, have the resources to start organizations, meaning that in theory, they would be able to form a charitable nonprofit, but in practice, it just never happens because there's just no resources for them to do that, because they can't come up with the registration money, or there's no lawyers who will help them figure out bylaws. And I think when you talk about political participation, it's also this enabling environment for political participation that needs to be taken into account. So it's really about also about whether or not civil society groups exist, and how many exist, and which parts of the LGBTI communities are represented in civil society organizations. So again, it's about the outcomes for people, not just the legal preconditions for an outcome.
Yes, I understand it. And do you have any suggestion on how this could be framed within these indicators here?
It could be within the LGBTI NGOs allowed. It could go a little bit further into not just LGBTI NGOs allowed, but the number of LGBTI NGOs that are in existence,
regardless if they are legally allowed or not. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And desegregate it into L and G and B and T and I. Ideally, and I don't know if this is feasible, but ideally, looking at the leadership of those organizations, because in researching trans and intersex communities around the world, we have found that leadership tells a lot about the focus of an organization. So for example, if an organization says it's LGBTI, but all of the leadership is gay, it's relatively unlikely that they'll have a strong focus on intersex issues. If the leadership is 95% intersex, it's a very strong likeliness that they will focus on intersex issues. So I think taking into account the leadership of an organization is really important, and Strength in Numbers and GATE will have some knowledge on how to actually measure that leadership.
Thank you for your relevant comments, Justus. So now, PGA, please, you may make an intervention.
Thank you. This is Monica and Alex with Parliamentarians for Global Action, and we would like to make 2 points. The first one, to Justus' comments, we would like just to add that perhaps one way to measure it, and as an indicator, could be LGBTI NGOs allowed to work publicly or to have activities without harassment. And so that may allow to indicate whether these NGOs are allowed under the law, but also they are able to do their work without harassment. So that would be one. And our second point regarding political participation, the name of the indicator LGBTI in Parliament, we would suggest adding perhaps another indicator that would be kind of a step one on whether political parties consider candidates that are LGBTI, or no, if their manifestos already include and call for the participation of LGBTI people in their political parties and in their campaigns as candidates.
Okay, thank you so much, Monica. Yuri?
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, great. So another question regarding also to the comments of Justus and PGA. So regarding the representation and possibility to register LGBT organization, like in our partners, they want to come out to the regional level, but some of the countries, they simply are LGBTQ organization, but they are not positioning themselves as so due to this risk of pressure from the governments, particularly in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So I mean, it will be hard to compare, because on the paper you will get the numbers that there might be none of this organization, but in reality they are existing. And unfortunately, I don't have the answer for you here right now how to compare that and how to include this option. And another comment would be regarding, sorry I didn't get the name of PGA speaker, is that how can we measure the participation in parliament? Many of the countries in our region would also say that they are non-openly ones. Maybe it could be possible to include some indicator if it will be relevant. Rather, there are parties which not like allowing LGBT to be in their party, but like actually supporting LGBTQI in their agenda. I don't know, it's for discussion. Rather, it can be the indicator for LGBT inclusion, that some parties are actually supporting human rights for LGBT. Thank you.
That's very relevant. Thank you, Yuri. So now, going to the second question, is the indicator relevant and available for a wide range of countries? Now we're talking about data collection, right? So does anybody have any views to share in relation to availability of the indicators? Andre?
Thanks. So I'll just come back and input. Just briefly, I think this kind of goes to the public opinion one, just to kind of highlight that my own organization has a public opinion survey, which has been conducted for the last couple of years using anonymous online surveys, gathering information from people in about 90 countries around the world at the moment, and more information will be released in bulk at the end of this month in October. So I think for public opinion information, the question is it available for a wide range of countries? Yes, I think there is for some things. There will be able to be information available for a wide range of countries in the near future. Of course, then when that comes out, there'll be a whole range of questions which people will be able to look at and see what's on there. The question then would be, you know, as we get this data as well, is it, you know, are we going to take, you know, gathering data from an anonymous survey online? Is that going to be data that we consider relevant and useful? That will be decided later. But I just wanted to mention that. Thanks.
Thank you, Andre. Laura?
Thanks. With regard to the indicator on LGBTI NGOs allowed, the data to establish this may need to go beyond a review of national law, because it may need to look at countries where registration happens at a lower level, so the records may not be in national law. And it may also be useful to include, I think Justice mentioned this earlier, issues around whether they're able to establish funding sources, or whether that is a barrier that is used to prevent them from operating in the country, which might not be specific in law, but may be used against them.
Oh, I see. But do you have a suggestion for another indicator, or do you think that's another aspect that should be considered within the LGBT NGOs allowed indicator?
I think it would need. I think it could go within the existing indicator, but I think the data that needs to be collected would need to include not just if the laws prohibit the foundation or the establishment of NGOs, but whether there are other laws or policies or practices that are used to prevent them registering or operating in some way.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laura. Jean, please.
Yes, hi, this is Jean Friedberg from the Human Rights Campaign. I want to just put a little note on what Andre was saying on the issue of the public opinion. I think, I'm not sure that the question, you know, is homosexuality or even being transgender, is that socially acceptable, is necessarily, is nuanced enough. I mean, it's such a very broad question, and people across a range of countries would answer that question very differently. I don't have a good answer, but I think that that question could possibly be refined, you know, in consultation with the polling people. I mean, folks who really could help us come up with really framing it in such a way that it is actually more universal across countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Does anybody else have any comments regarding the availability of data? You probably have seen that we divided the indicators. We have in terms of feasibility, because many of the data are already available, but others are not. So I think everyone should take this into consideration as well. And if you have any ideas or any suggestions of data that are existing that we are not aware of, please share it with us. Any further comments on that? Okay, so now going to question 3. Would the use of any indicator necessitate the generation of new data? So here we're looking for feedback on any opportunities and challenges in relation to data collection, especially in terms of the data that we do not have so far, and that it may take them a while to be collected. Does anybody have any comments on that? Since none, I'll go to question 4. Do you have any technical inputs on the construction, drafting, wording of the proposed indicators? So we already discussed with Justus some ideas for new formulations of indicators, but if there's any other comments on that or any other suggestions on drafting, wording, please share with us. Is there anybody willing to speak? Tina, you may have the floor.
Hello. I think the decriminalization of transgender people, I would change the wording because it's not necessarily targeting only transgender people. If it's based on gender expression, the person does not have to be transgender. Sorry?
I think somebody has their mic on. If there's anybody with the mic on, could you please turn it off?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Sorry about that, Tina.
Did you hear me before?
Yes, could you start again, please?
Yeah, sure. So the indicator, which is decriminalization of transgender people, I think I would change the wording because it's if it's based on gender expression, then it's not specifically only might targeting trans people, but it might involve anyone, and the person does not have to identify as trans or being trans at all, I think.
Okay, thank you. Andre?
Yeah, it was just simply to go back on the previous question. I was taking a little slower to respond to some of the questions. Thinking about is new data needed? I mean, for me, when I look at the table, it helps to see the numbers 1, 2, and 3, and knowing that number 1, feasibility, means that the data exists already. 2 is where it's there, but would still need to be gathered, and then 3 is the one. So the only one that's actually listed 3 on the list is, of course, being transgender is acceptable. But I also heard Justus mentioning earlier about intersex people. So that would be another piece of information that would need to be collected. And of course, just to kind of flag that I think as we're raising suggestions throughout this call, as people are going into ever deeper nuances, which is important, on how we should collect data, and if we're registering an NGO, that we need to look beyond the exact law and actually see what realities, whether it's funding or leadership or other ways that NGOs are facing challenges. That, of course, is huge amounts of data. So I think if people aren't saying that new data specifically needs to be collected, as we're coming up with suggestions, we're obviously creating a wish list, which is going to have feasibility questions around it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't suggest them, because I'm a big believer in dreaming big, but I just wanted to flag that.
Thank you so much, Andre. That's very useful to hear. Does anybody else have anything to add in terms of wording and construction and drafting of the indicators? Since none, let's go to question number 5. Are there any key gaps that you see in this list that we shared? Okay, thank you, Justice. Does anybody want to speak about gaps? Okay, since none. Andre, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and I think it just to go back to in the introduction when I ran through the overview of what our civil and political rights are, a lot of those were potential gaps. And again, I did frame it as I've just done on my previous comment in terms of feasibility and understanding the limits. But and also I think just also bearing in mind other parts of the LGBTI indicators, particularly personal safety and violence. I think there's quite an overlap between the framing of civil and political rights and personal safety and violence. Things that do come to me are torture. Torture doesn't yet seem to be mentioned directly, and whether that is something, because I know that does cut across the LGBTI spectrum. Maybe it's actually it comes out in different ways and different indicators with different types of torture, whether it's forced sterilization, whether it's intersex surgeries or anal examinations. I think it might come up in different spaces, but I just wanted to flag that as a potential gap area if we're not looking at torture. And I think also the one that I did mention in my introduction, which I'll just highlight again, is people being arrested, like the rates of people being arrested. And I think Justus has certainly mentioned this before, but I would just kind of reflag it as like that's the lived reality that we see, is a lot of people just facing daily street harassment by authorities. Don't know how we measure it, might be difficult, but I think it's a potential gap still. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. And just to clarify, the issue of torture and other degrading treatments are already included in the dimension, in the 5th dimension, which is personal security and violence. So that will be covered. All of your comments on different kinds of torture, including sterilization and arrests, they're definitely covered in that dimension. Soren, you may speak.
Thank you. I was wondering in regard to political participation, and I must say that I was not able to be here at the beginning, so maybe it has been addressed, but I was wondering about political participation, that it addresses only LGBTI, openly LGBTI people in the political sphere. Lot of rights we get through the political sphere, not through openly LGBTI persons, but by other persons who are fighting our case, so to say. So I miss a kind of measure on the way that the political sphere work to our benefit.
Okay, thank you, Soren. Could you please repeat your last question?
Me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry. It was not a question. I would like, for instance, to see a measure on the number of bills proposed regarding LGBTI rights, say. That might not be proposed by only LGBTI persons in the parliament, but anyone else. But it would give a measure regarding our rights and our situation in the political sphere.
Okay, thank you. And do you have any suggestion how this could be framed within this dimension, within this indicator, sorry?
Yeah, I would say under political participation, for instance, a measure of the number of bills or other kind of proposals in the parliament. That could be a.
Okay, thank you, Soren. I kindly ask everyone, if there's anyone with their mic on, could you please turn it off? Thank you. Pata, you may speak.
Yes, I joined a little later, but I heard about this, about the torture thing, and the same thing I have, not about torture, but about the freedom of expression. I know that freedom of expression is down there in the security and violence, but shouldn't not be this part as the freedom of association and in the physical violence, to have whether the marches or meetings have been targeted. I don't know, like, so there is one thing if people can officially meet, if there are laws that prohibit meeting LGBTI people outside in the streets, in public spaces. And another thing is that whether these meetings have been happening and then targeted violently. That's my comment.
Thank you, Pata. Do you have any suggestion on how this could be incorporated in this political and civic?
Like to add with yeah, maybe we can expand that indicator about the freedom of assembly and association, and also freedom of expression somehow, and then to have in the security part, in the security dimension, to have it tracked down whether some you know, some attacks have been happening, and whether they have been investigated or responded by the governments down in the other dimension.
Okay, thank you, Pata. Is there anybody willing to comment on the issue of gaps? Andre, you may have the floor.
And it's partly as a contributor, but actually mainly more is just kind of requesting input. I don't think there's any specific bisexual indicators themselves, and I know that we did talk about public opinion. We talked specifically about intersex, and we talked specifically about LG and B, and there's been a proposal to discuss intersex, and I don't know if there's any bisexual activists on this call in particular who have any considerations about specific needs relating to bisexual population. So that was just, it's kind of more of a question to others, but it's also just a kind of a flagging of a potential gap in the absence of other voices. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. So are there anyone in particular willing to speak on in reaction to Andrea's suggestion? Okay, since none, Andrea's suggestion kind of goes to the next question, which is, are there any gaps in indicators for any LGBTI populations? We know that some indicators are specific to different kinds of subgroups within the LGBTI population. And obviously, we want to cover as many subgroups as possible. So do you have any suggestions regarding to these kind of gaps? Or any other comments? Since none, I'll go to question number 7, which is, do you have any suggestions of which indicators in the list should be prioritized for the civic and political participation dimension? Jim?
Yes, hi, sorry. I was a bit not asleep at the wheel here. I want to go back to the one about gaps.
Sure.
And I don't know how much data exists or doesn't exist or anything, but one of the the hallmarks of sort of an engaged community is the presence of civil society groups. And I'm just wondering if there was any discussion ever about, whether to look at the existence of those as some kind of an indicator of engagement or something or other.
Do you mean, is that not covered on the LGBTI NGOs allowed, or is that something different? Sorry, I didn't understand very well your question.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Let me just look at that here. It's not even so much allowed. It's a matter of the extent to which they exist. Is there an active civil society? I mean, maybe that's not a reasonable way to try to get at the question, but it's not just so much are they allowed to exist, but do they exist? In other words, is there a civic environment in which they're allowed to exist and flourish?
Okay, very well. Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else have any comments on the gaps? Okay, well, since none, in terms of, oh, sorry, is that Monica?
Hi everyone, this is Alex from PGA. Quick
Okay.
comment about the indicator number 3, gender recognition. It is defined as allow gender recognition without medical interventions, psychological diagnostics, etc. But one factor that is not included in the definition is the fact that in certain states, this process requires an authorization by a judge, judicial approval, which maybe has been left out on purpose for a variety of reasons, but if not, I think should be considered, since the approval of a judge goes against the idea that once one person has his or her identity, and that should be respected and accepted by the state without any process, any judicial process going on.
Sorry, is your name Alex?
Yes.
Okay, Alex. Could you please repeat your comment closer to the microphone, because the interpreter couldn't hear what you're saying.
Okay, sure. The point is that the indicator number 3, gender recognition, includes certain factors like medical interventions and psychological diagnosis that shouldn't be included. Shouldn't be a part of the process to allow gender recognition, but it does not include a specific factor, which is the approval by a judge, judicial approval.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, are there any other comments regarding gaps? And what about prioritization? We mentioned earlier that we could have only a maximum of 10 indicators. And obviously within this civic and political participation dimension, you only have 9. But if we were to prioritize, do you have any suggestions? Okay, since none, is there any additional inputs on indicators or any other additional indicators that you think should be included in this dimension? I know some people have suggested a couple of things, but if you have further comments or further suggestions, please feel free to comment. Well, since none, I would like to invite my co-chair, Andre, again for some final comments on the discussions we had so far.
Sure. And thank you, Lucas. Well, I've been listening and I've been speaking a bit as well, as you know. And so I'm just going to, things that I've heard as we've been talking in no particular order at all. But I think the lived reality for LGBTI people in our disaggregated, wonderful diversity and complication and how we can measure that seems to be something that resonates. I think we're all very clear that the existence of a law or a policy is not enough when actually on the ground our experience is something quite different. So again, as we've said plenty of times, recognizing the difficulties of measuring that, it's something which we, I think, I've heard people kind of convene on. We've talked about public opinion, and I think I've sensed that people have wanted to have public opinion expressed across the whole range of LGBTI, but also recognizing the complications of the wording of what public opinion should be. Is it enough just to ask the question, is this socially acceptable? Are we actually looking at a slightly different kind of a question to ask the general population? So that would be a question we would probably take to the next stage of this process. There was quite a lot of discussion around the existence of LGBT and I civil society and ways that we can measure that. That's part of our civic participation, how we actually engage in political processes. And while there was recognition that, yes, there are specific laws that allow or do not allow LGBTI NGOs to incorporate, actually maybe what we have to have is that to be nuanced a bit more. Potentially that could be an indicator which talks about LGBTI is allowed to work publicly but without harassment, for example, or certainly looking beyond the national laws, but what are the other laws that are used to prevent these NGOs from being established? Because governments can be tricky creatures. They'll use anything to get us sometimes. I think another one that for me was particularly interesting was looking at the practical aspects of civic participation for LGBTI folk, and looking into leadership, funding, capacity issues, again disaggregated across the acronym. So there was a proposal for the number of LGBTI NGOs in existence in a particular state. But again, emphasizing the disaggregation into acronyms and perhaps ideally looking at the leadership of those organizations as well. The political participation by our governments, we see, of course, the percentage of members of parliament or our other national representative body who are openly LGBTI. And there were questions raised around that, whether we could expand beyond into potentially it could be what they're doing for us. Would that be the number of bills that are proposed by those parliaments that protect LGBTI rights? Or maybe it was to have the stage before we get to parliaments and talk about candidates in political parties that are LGBTI themselves, or potentially just have manifestos that openly call for LGBTI participation, or they welcome LGBTI people into their party membership. There was discussion, we talked about the overlap with different areas, particularly with the personal safety and violence area, and noticed that there are some things which might fall within this area that actually fall in that. So things like torture, violence, arrest, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. I think we don't want to step outside the realm of what this particular webinar is focusing on, but would just trust that webinar makes sure that those issues are indeed covered, since we're not covering them specifically here. And I have not repeated everything that everybody has said. I have been taking notes here, and of course this has been recorded, but I think those are some of the main points that I've heard, which would certainly go on to the next stage. So I'll hand back to you, Lucas.
Thank you, Andrea, for your very useful summary, and obviously everyone for these very valuable suggestions. So does anybody have anything to comment on the suggestions made, which Andrea summarized very well? Or any other questions? Well, if anybody has any questions or comments, please write them to our email indicators@rfcell.se. And I would like to thank everyone for engaging in the process and for participating in the call today. And thank you so much, Andre, for your contributions. And thanks a lot to the interpreters and to Micah for technical assistance. And have a great day, night, whatever you are. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.